So again, the writ of certiorari, that means when the Supreme Court issues that writ, you are going to the Supreme Court. Does anyone remember the rule? How many votes does it take for the Supreme Court to hear a case?
4 votes, rule of 4.
Rule of 4, perfect. Thanks, Rachel. So the rule of 4 basically says there's court sitting around the table. They're like, okay, should we decide to hear this case or not? 4 of the 9 justices must vote to hear the case, and then they issue that writ. The writ of certiorari means, okay, the case is now going to go to the Supreme Court. We start up with oral arguments. Remember, both sides have 30 minutes to present their case. Typically at this point, the 9 justices have researched the case. They have people that work for them. They already kind of have an idea of what the case is about, and they are just meant to ask questions. If the Supreme Court asks questions, they can really milk all of the 30 minutes for either side of the case because they do not get any extensions, okay? So this becomes petitioners versus the respondents. Petitioners, the people that are bringing the case, like Brown v. Board. Brown would be the petitioner, and the respondent are the people responding to those charges. In this case, the Board of Education for Topeka, Kansas. The 9 justices, again, hear that case. So we get into opinions. The document that explains the Supreme Court's judgment and their reasoning for it. So on your one-pagers, it has the majority opinion, okay? The majority opinion is going to be like, here's why the majority of the court ruled in this instance, okay? But the second one is going to be concurring opinion. A concurring opinion means the justices agreed with that judgment, but they disagree with why the reasoning for it. Not every case has a concurring opinion. A dissenting opinion, okay, these are written by justices who disagree with the judgment. So they are, they were outvoted, they were, not on the winning side of that argument, so they issue a dissenting opinion. Does anyone know who decides who writes these opinions? Anyone? Who decides who writes the opinions? Thanks, Curtis. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court does, he assigns, or could be a she, they assign the who's writing which opinion. So this then becomes the enforcement. And this is one of the biggest roadblocks to a Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court can make a decision, but it's up to the other branches on how those are enforced. So, the judges might make a decision, but then it could be a bureaucratic agency. It could be altering the law or a new law being passed. That enforcement is tough. The Supreme Court can make that decision. Can anyone think of an example from a case that we talked about where the Supreme Court's decision was not immediately enforced?
Brown v. Board of Education.
Thank you, Maddie. We had Brown v. Board 1 and then Brown v. Board 2. Okay, they initially put through that decision, and they said, hey, listen, you've got to do it with all due speed. So again, they came back later and said states were going to drag their feet and kind of do this, the segregation after the fact. Judicial review, okay? So judicial review, the Supreme Court can declare any government action unconstitutional. So the case for judicial reviews comes from Article 3. The justices are elected and they are not elected, and they serve for life. So it removes them having to run for re-election. They don't have to cater to people voting for them. Once you are on the Supreme Court, you are there for life. Fed 78 says Article 3, creates an independent judiciary which should interpret the Constitution fairly. We looked back at some of the judges, and John Roberts was the example that I gave you in class of someone who really started further right and conservative and kind of have moved more towards the middle as a moderate judge. George W. Bush having appointed him, he was very, very conservative at that point. And over the years, some of his opinions have softened his conservatism. But this is the case that you should be adding into that one pager. If you're doing a one pager, oh my goodness, why are these three things not on there for you? Article 3 in the powers of the court, Federalist 78 creating an independent judiciary, and then Marbury versus Madison. That's that first case of judicial review. Okay, it is emphatically the job of the judicial department to say what the law is. Okay, so these three things establish the court's ability to review or interpret laws, and it's their job to say this law may or may not be a violation of the Constitution. So what are some checks that the other branches have on the Supreme Court? How does someone get on the Supreme Court? Anyone?
Appointment by the president.
Nominated by the president.
That's what I meant.
Okay.
Don't they have to be approved by
Nominated the
Congress?
president, confirmed by Congress, yeah.
They have to, not by Congress
to be-
specifically, Alyssa. What branch?
Oh,
They have to be confirmed by the Senate.
Correct. Okay, so the president can nominate someone, what we saw with Brett Kavanaugh, and then they are confirmed by the Senate. So now you have the other two branches in check there. Let's do this. Okay, how many members of the does the Supreme Court have?
9.
9. Let's see from Brendan. Let's see from Carissa. Good. And then why aren't justices elected?
So they can be free from political pressure and make decisions based on the Constitution.
Correct. So justices, I mean, these are checks that the court, that on the court. So if you end up getting anything that starts talking about checks that the court has, great, Curtis, like you said, you know, they removed the politics from it. Sophie says they're to maintain neutrality. Veronica, love you pulling that word, insulation. Okay, they're insulated from public opinion in the fact that they do not have to run for re-election. Now, there are some judges in state courts that can be that are not necessarily, well, they can be elected. Sometimes judges are on the ballot for a yes or no, they're confirmed. But as far as the United States Supreme Court is concerned, they are nominated by the president, they are confirmed by the Senate, they serve a life term until they pass away or they retire. Okay. All of you who've worked a couple ahead here, tell you what, I'm gonna go down the participants. Who's someone we haven't heard from yet? Subal, I'm dropping the mic. Subal, what's stare decisis?
Can you say that again?
What is stare decisis?
Hold up. Oh, isn't it the one with like precedent? So they base it off like previous decisions.
That is true. Ewan, do you know, can you tell me what stare decisis means? It's Latin for what, Ewan?
Friend of the court.
Ooh, that's amicus
Yeah,
curiae.
that's not the one. I don't remember what it's Latin for, but isn't it like a document that they send? I don't know. I'm full of crap. Don't listen to me.
You're good, dude. No worries. I'm throwing something at you. Rebecca has it with let the decision stand. Stare decisis, let the decision stand. So sometimes if they choose not to hear a case, okay, that means they've issued a stare decisis, which means the lower court decision is going to stand. So you see this oftentimes in cases that start in state courts. They work their way up through the appellate system. They might make it to a state Supreme Court, and each time they lose, they appeal, and it gets to the United States Supreme Court. That's the last stop. And if the U.S. Supreme Court decides not to hear that case, stare decisis, let the decision stand. That means basically they are done. That is the end there. So that is how a court case moves its way through. If I were you, I'm going to exit out of here. These are the notes that we had in class. I just copied and pasted the link very obviously. Okay, it goes through Fed 78. That would be, you know, again, something worth going through. The purpose, you know, that the judiciary would not trample on individual rights. Why is it relevant? It establishes judicial review. Talk about senatorial courtesy. We look at Article 3, appellate jurisdiction. There's Kavanaugh. Okay, it would be worth your time going back through those notes, going back through your blue sheets, because I hope you have them at this point. But yeah, let's take a look at the 2 FRQs for this week, because I think this is something that's pretty important. So here, the first one is your argumentative essay. And this is going to come down to these 2 words. Whoop. Judicial activism and judicial restraint. Now, I'd love to sit around and have us define that, but because this is part of your FRQ, I'm going to keep that into our check-ins tomorrow and on Friday. But that is what you're arguing, okay? The Supreme Court should pursue judicial activism or judicial restraint, and the 3 documents that you can use are Article 3, Fed 78, and Brown v. Board of Education. So if you are not, let's just say it like it is, use the 3-paragraph model, follow that template. Your thesis should be in the first paragraph. You should underline your thesis. Your thesis should establish a line of reasoning. Pardon me. I would say if you're talking judicial activism or judicial restraint, that at the very least you are using Article 3 or Fed 78. I think there's an argument to be made for both, but I also think when you look at Brown v. Board reinterpreting and overturning what case? Anyone? What case did Brown v. Board overturn? Do. Separate but equal, Plessy versus Ferguson. Very good, very good. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is your, the second FRQ is your concept analysis, and this is all about Brett Kavanaugh. Now this starts to interweave the interactions between branches. What's the Congress's role in the makeup of the Supreme Court? How partisan divisions affect the role? And why the Constitution ensures the legislative and executive branch have ways to control court membership. So really, I want your focus this week to be on judicial activism, judicial restraint. I think this is a super likely kind of style question that you would see on the AP test on May 11th. I think that's pretty fair. I bet whatever they ask you is going to hit something that we've discussed either the previous few weeks or this week or next. When it comes to the concept analysis, I think anything goes, but again, we want to keep this focused on the courts itself. 1 second here. Let me stop sharing here. Let me are there any questions that we have not answered or direction that you would like to have before we wrap things up here? Make sure I got some people that added late. Okay, so before I start recording or stop recording here, again, guys, please review Chapter 6, those notes. Look at the notes that we had posted on Canvas prior to. There's a practice quiz. You're looking at judicial activism, judicial restraint in the argumentative essay. You're looking at Congress and the president's role in the Supreme Court nomination process and the concept analysis. You should take time on your block day tomorrow or Wednesday to respond to that prompt. We'll have our regularly scheduled check-ins tomorrow during your class periods, the first 20 minutes or so. On Friday at 2 o'clock, we will come back together and discuss responses or appropriate pathways into this. Is there anything else for the good of the order before we wrap up our time here? All right. Well, let me just pause our recording.